I never thought I would tell this to anyone. I had buried this secret so deep inside myself for so many years that sometimes it seemed like it had never really happened, like it was just a very vivid dream or an invention of my own mind trying to process something I couldn't understand. But now, at 52 years old, after carrying this alone for so long, I finally understand that I can no longer remain silent. That Carlo asked me for something very specific that September afternoon, and I have an obligation to fulfill it, even if it means people will think I'm crazy or that I'm making up stories for attention. Because what happened in that small cafe near Milano Centrale on September 8th, 2006, was impossible. A 15-year-old boy I had never met before looked into my eyes and told me about the most shameful secret of my entire life, a secret I had never spoken aloud to anyone, not to my wife, not to my therapist, not even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. And 4 days later, he was dead. My name is Vicente. I was born in 1972 into a very traditional family in Milan. My father was a lawyer, corporate law, contracts, the kind of work that required precision and skepticism in equal measure. My mother was a literature professor at the Università degli Studi di Milano, specializing in 19th century Italian realism. Our home was filled with books stacked on every available surface, and dinner conversations that ranged from Machiavelli's political philosophy to the latest corruption scandals in Italian politics. I grew up in an environment where everything was questioned, analyzed, dissected. Faith was treated as a quaint historical artifact, something our grandparents believed in, but which modern educated people had evolved beyond. My father would say, with his characteristic dry humor, "Vicente, there are only two things you can truly trust in this world: a well-written contract and verifiable evidence. Everything else is just wishful thinking dressed up in ceremony." That worldview shaped me completely. By the time I was 18, I had already developed a thoroughly rational and thoroughly skeptical approach to anything that couldn't be proven or verified through the scientific method. I wasn't hostile to religion. I found it fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but I saw it primarily as a social construct, a mechanism humans had developed to cope with mortality and uncertainty. I became a journalist, not the kind who writes puff pieces or entertainment news, but an investigative journalist specializing in religious fraud. For years, I worked exposing faith healers who preyed on desperate cancer patients, televangelists who built mansions with money donated by pensioners living on fixed incomes, and so-called miracle workers who staged elaborate theatrical performances designed to separate vulnerable people from their life savings. Each case I investigated reinforced my conviction that religion was fundamentally a tool, sometimes benign, often exploitative, for manipulating human fear of death and the unknown. I had seen too many tears, too many empty bank accounts, too many families destroyed by charismatic charlatans who wrapped their greed in the language of divine love. By 2006, at age 34, I had built a reputation as one of the most thorough investigative journalists in northern Italy when it came to religious fraud. My articles had led to several criminal investigations and had helped recover hundreds of thousands of euros for victims. I was proud of this work. It felt like a calling, using reason and evidence to protect people from those who would exploit their faith. But beneath that professional pride was something else, something I didn't talk about, something I barely acknowledged even to myself. The thing about carrying a secret shame is that it colors everything you do, even, especially, the things you're most proud of. My crusade against religious fraud wasn't purely altruistic. It was penance. In 1995, when I was 23 years old and just starting my journalism career at a small Milanese newspaper called Il Giorno Lombardo, I received information about a major corruption scheme. A source, a low-level accountant with a conscience, had approached me with documents showing that several local politicians and business owners were systematically diverting public funds designated for hospitals and schools. The evidence was solid. Bank transfers, forged contracts, emails discussing the distribution of stolen money. If published, the story would have been explosive. It would have launched my career. More importantly, it would have stopped the theft of millions of euros from institutions that desperately needed them. Money meant for pediatric cancer wards, for school libraries, for equipment that could save lives. I worked on that investigation for 6 weeks. I verified every document, confirmed every source, built an airtight case that any editor would have been proud to publish. And then, one of the men involved in the scheme found out I was investigating him. His name was Alessandro Marchetti, a businessman with connections throughout Milan's political and media establishment. He didn't threaten me directly. Men like him never do. He simply invited me to lunch at an expensive restaurant in the Brera district, ordered wine I couldn't pronounce, and explained, in the tone one might use to discuss weather patterns, exactly how my journalism career would end if I published that story. He had contacts at every major newspaper in Italy. One phone call from him, he explained, and I would never work as a journalist again. Not in Milan, not in Rome, not anywhere. I was young, I was nobody, and he was connected to people who could erase my future with a signature. "Vicente," he said, swirling his wine glass, once seemed like a smart young man, smart enough to understand that there are many important stories to investigate in this world, stories about organized crime, about international corruption, about real villains. Why waste your talent on something so local, so small? Think about your career. Think about all the good you could do with a long, successful career in journalism versus ending it before it even begins over something that, frankly, will be exposed by someone else eventually anyway. I was 23 years old. I was scared. I was thinking about my future, about my dreams of becoming a respected investigative journalist, about making my parents proud. So I made the most cowardly decision of my entire life. I didn't publish the story. I took all those documents, every bank transfer, every forged contract, every piece of evidence, and I locked them in a drawer in my apartment. I told my editor that the story had fallen apart, that my sources had been unreliable, that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. And I moved on to other stories, safer stories, stories that wouldn't threaten powerful men with powerful connections. The corruption scheme continued for 3 more years, 3 years of stolen money, of hospitals that couldn't afford equipment, of schools that couldn't repair leaking roofs or buy new textbooks. Finally, in 1998, another journalist, braver than me, more principled than me, exposed the entire operation in a front-page investigation that won National Journalism Awards and led to multiple criminal convictions. I read that series of articles with a mixture of relief and self-loathing so intense I physically felt sick. Relief that the truth had finally come out. Self-loathing because it should have been me. Those 3 years of continued theft, those millions of additional euros stolen from vulnerable public institutions, that was on me. That was the price of my cowardice. I never told anyone about this, not my colleagues who assumed I had simply failed on that early investigation, the way young journalists sometimes do. Not my wife Elena, whom I met 2 years later and married in 2000. Not the therapist I saw briefly in 2003 when I was dealing with what I told her was generalized anxiety, but which was actually very specific guilt. Instead, I channeled all that guilt into my work exposing religious fraud. I became absolutely merciless in my investigations. I worked longer hours than anyone else in the newsroom. I pursued cases that other journalists considered too small or too difficult. And I built a reputation for being not just thorough, but almost obsessively committed to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. It was redemption work. I knew that. But I never let myself examine too closely what I was seeking redemption for. By 2006, I had convinced myself I had moved past that failure. I told myself that everyone makes mistakes when they're young, that I had more than made up for it through years of good work, that dwelling on the past was pointless. But the guilt was always there, just beneath the surface, a cold stone lodged somewhere behind my sternum, and it informed everything. My cynicism about human nature, my distrust of anyone who claimed moral authority, my conviction that institutions and ideals were fundamentally corrupt and that the only reliable force in the world was hard evidence and rational skepticism. September 8th, 2006 was a Friday. I remember because I had been planning to take the weekend off, a rare luxury in my profession, but had agreed to do one more interview for a story I was working on about a supposed faith healer operating in Milan's periphery. The man called himself Fratello Salvatore and claimed to have healing powers granted directly by the Virgin Mary. He had been charging desperate people, mostly elderly cancer patients and parents of sick children, exorbitant amounts of money for healing sessions that consisted of laying hands on them while speaking in what he claimed was an ancient Aramaic prayer language, but which I strongly suspected was complete gibberish. I had spent the morning in a cramped apartment in the Grottosolio district, interviewing an elderly woman named Signora Bartoli, who had paid Fratello Salvatore 12,000 euros, her entire life savings, for treatments that were supposed to cure her stage 4 ovarian cancer. The treatments, predictably, had done nothing. The cancer had progressed, and now she was dying, broke, in a tiny apartment that smelled of illness and desperation. "He seemed so sincere," she had told me, her hands shaking as she held a cup of chamomile tea. "He knew things about me, Vicente, things about my childhood, about my first husband, who died young. How could he know those things if God wasn't speaking through him?" I had heard variations of this story dozens of times. Cold reading techniques, research, lucky guesses, the human tendency to fit ambiguous statements to personal circumstances. I explained this to her gently. She had been victimized enough already without me being cruel, and left with a notebook full of damning quotes and a heart full of the familiar mixture of rage and sadness that characterized most of my work. I decided to stop at a small cafe near Milano Centrale before heading back to my newspaper office. The place was called Caffè Verdi, one of those unremarkable establishments that exist in every Italian city. Decent espresso, a few pastries, scattered tables occupied by students with laptops, and elderly men reading newspapers. I ordered an espresso and a cornetto, planning to spend a few minutes organizing my notes before returning to write up the Fratello Salvatore story. That's when I noticed the boy. He was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over a laptop, with an expression of deep concentration on his face. 15, maybe 16 years old, with dark hair and an intensity that seemed unusual for a teenager on a Friday afternoon. He wore jeans, sneakers, and a casual t-shirt, completely ordinary. What caught my attention was his laptop screen. Even from several meters away, I could see the web page he had open. It was about Eucharistic miracles, specifically about cases where communion hosts had allegedly transformed into human heart tissue, complete with photographs and what appeared to be scientific analysis. Exactly the kind of religious content I had learned to be deeply suspicious of. My journalist instincts kicked in immediately, mingled with the cynicism I had carefully cultivated over years of exposing religious fraud. I found myself walking toward his table, my espresso forgotten, drawn by that familiar compulsion to challenge, to question, to expose the flawed thinking behind religious belief. "Do you actually believe that stuff?" I asked, gesturing toward his screen. My tone was probably more aggressive than it needed to be. I was still carrying the anger from Signora Bartoli's apartment. The boy looked up at me with an expression of complete calm. No defensiveness, no offense, just a kind of gentle curiosity about who this stranger was who had just interrupted his work. "Yes," he said simply, in Italian that was fluent, but carried the faintest hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "I do. Would you like to sit down?" There was something disarming about the directness of the invitation. I found myself pulling out the chair across from him without quite meaning to. "I'm Carlo," he said, extending his hand with a formality that seemed oddly old-fashioned for a teenager. "Carlo Acutis." "Vicente," I replied, shaking his hand. "I'm a journalist. I investigate religious fraud." I said it bluntly, almost aggressively, expecting it to put him on the defensive. Instead, his face lit up with genuine interest. "That must be fascinating work," he said. "There are so many people who manipulate faith for personal gain. It's one of the most evil things someone can do, taking something sacred and using it to hurt vulnerable people." I blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't the response I had expected. "So you agree that most religious claims are fraudulent?" "No," Carlo said, smiling slightly. "I think many claims made by people about religion are fraudulent, but that doesn't mean the underlying reality is false. If someone forges a 100-euro note, that doesn't mean real 100-euro notes don't exist. It just means you need to be careful to distinguish the real from the fake. It was a good analogy. I hated that it was a good analogy. And you think Eucharistic miracles are real? I asked, gesturing toward his laptop screen. You think communion bread literally transforms into human tissue? I don't think it, Carlo replied calmly. I've researched the evidence. Would you like to see? And before I could respond, he had turned his laptop toward me and begun walking me through his research with the systematic precision of a doctoral student defending a thesis. For the next hour, Carlo Acutis proceeded to dismantle every assumption I had brought to that table. He showed me laboratory analysis from 1971 in Lanciano, Italy, where researchers had analyzed tissue from an 8th century Eucharistic miracle. The tissue, preserved without any chemical treatment for over 1,000 years, had been identified as human myocardial tissue, heart muscle, by Dr. Edoardo Linoli, a professor of anatomy and pathological histology at the University of Siena. The analysis showed, Carlo explained, pulling up the scientific documentation, that the tissue contains proteins in the same proportions as living tissue. It's AB positive blood type, the same blood type found in other authenticated Eucharistic miracles in Buenos Aires, Tixla in Mexico, and Sakuka in Poland. The probability of this being coincidence decreases with each verified case. He showed me photographs from Buenos Aires in 1996, where a communion host had fallen on the floor during distribution, and when placed in water to dissolve according to church protocol, had instead transformed into what appeared to be bloody tissue. Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gómez, an atheist neuroscientist and cardiologist, had analyzed it without being told its origin. Castañón's conclusion, Carlo said, reading directly from the scientific report, was that the sample consisted of human heart tissue from the left ventricle, showing signs of acute stress, as if the person had been severely beaten in the chest region. When he was finally told the origin of the tissue, he converted to Catholicism. I tried to poke holes in his research. These could be contamination, human DNA getting into the samples during handling. That's what I thought too, Carlo said, nodding, which is why the most compelling cases are the ones with multiple witnesses and immediate documentation. In Sakuka, Poland, in 2008, 2 years from now, this will happen again, with photographs taken at each stage of the transformation, tissue analysis by independent laboratories, and documentation by church officials who were initially skeptical. He spoke about a 2008 event as if it had already happened. I noticed this, but filed it away as awkward phrasing. Carlo pulled up case after case, not just Eucharistic miracles, but documented healing at Lourdes that had been verified by the Lourdes Medical Bureau, an organization that includes non-Catholic and atheist doctors. Tumors disappearing instantaneously, nerve damage reversing completely, diseases with no known cure suddenly going into complete remission. The Medical Bureau has documented over 7,000 unexplained healings, Carlo explained. They only recognize something as miraculous if it's instantaneous, complete, lasting, and medically impossible. Only 70 cases in over 150 years have met those criteria. These aren't people claiming to feel better or showing gradual improvement. These are documented cases of physical impossibilities. What struck me wasn't just the evidence itself, I could find ways to be skeptical of any individual case, but the way Carlo presented it, he didn't speak like a teenage true believer trying to defend his faith. He spoke like a researcher presenting data, calmly addressing potential objections, acknowledging the limitations of various studies, and focusing on cases with the strongest documentation. "Why do you care so much about this?" I finally asked. "You're 15 years old. Most kids your age are interested in football and video games, not researching medieval miracles." Carlo smiled. "I love video games. I play Super Mario, Pokemon, Halo. I'm actually pretty good at them. And I love programming. I built this entire website myself using HTML and CSS. But I also love the Eucharist. And I think one of the problems with how the church presents itself is that we act like you have to choose between being modern and being faithful, between loving technology and loving God. I don't think that's true. I think you can use modern tools to share eternal truths. There was something profoundly genuine about the way he spoke. No pretense, no performance, just a straightforward explanation of his worldview, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I was born in London on May 3rd, 1991, he continued, though I hadn't asked. "My family moved to Milan when I was a baby. I've been going to daily Mass since I was 7. I want to use my computer skills to create tools that help people encounter God, especially young people who might never set foot in a church, but who spend hours online every day. And you're not worried that modern scientific worldviews are fundamentally incompatible with religious faith?" I asked. "No," Carlo said simply. "I think bad science is incompatible with faith, and bad theology is incompatible with reason. But real science and real faith point toward the same truth. The universe follows laws, physical laws, mathematical laws, and those laws had to come from somewhere. Science tells us what those laws are. Faith tells us why they exist." I wanted to disagree, but I found I couldn't formulate a coherent objection. He had preempted every argument I might have made. We talked for another 30 minutes about various topics: his love for animals, especially dogs, his close relationship with his mother, his normal teenage life that somehow coexisted with this extraordinary spiritual depth. And throughout the conversation, I kept feeling increasingly unsettled, not because anything he said was threatening, but because his calm certainty challenged the entire framework I had built my life around. And then, without warning, the conversation took a turn I could never have anticipated. Carlo stopped talking about Eucharistic miracles. He closed his laptop with deliberate care, leaned back in his chair, and looked at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Vicente," he said, and the way he said my name, with a gentleness that somehow contained absolute certainty, made my heart begin to race. "You're carrying something very heavy, a guilt that's been with you for a long time. Would you like to talk about it?" The cafe noise seemed to fade away. I was suddenly hyper-aware of my own breathing, of the rapid thudding of my pulse in my throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice came out wrong, defensive, brittle. "Yes, you do," Carlo said softly. "It happened in 1995, when you were 23 years old. You had evidence of corruption, politicians and businessmen stealing money meant for hospitals and schools. You had all the documentation you needed to publish the story. But someone threatened your career, and you were scared, so you buried the investigation. And then 3 years later, someone else published it, and you've been carrying the guilt of those 3 extra years of theft ever since. I couldn't breathe. The cafe was spinning slightly. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard, my knuckles went white. How? I couldn't form the question. How could he possibly know this? You've spent 11 years trying to make up for it, Carlo continued, his voice impossibly gentle. All your work exposing religious fraud, protecting vulnerable people. It's penance. You're trying to balance the scales. But it doesn't work, does it? No matter how many frauds you expose, no matter how many people you help, the guilt is still there, still cold and heavy in your chest. Tears were starting to form in my eyes. I blinked them back furiously, unwilling to cry in front of this stranger, this impossible boy who had somehow reached into the most guarded part of my soul. You've never told anyone, Carlo said. Not your wife Elena, not the therapist you saw in 2003, not your colleagues. You've carried it completely alone because you're afraid that if you speak it aloud, it will become too real to bear. Stop, I whispered. How are you? And you've built your entire identity around skepticism and rationalism, Carlo continued, not just because you're naturally inclined that way, but because as long as everything can be explained by evidence and logic, you don't have to face the possibility that there might be moral laws you violated, that there might be a God who saw what you did and knows exactly how much it cost. I was crying now, silently, tears running down my face while I sat frozen in my chair. Vicente, Carlo said, and his voice was so full of compassion it physically hurt to hear. You've been forgiven for a long time. You just haven't forgiven yourself. Forgiven by whom? I managed to choke out. I don't even believe in God. Yes, you do, Carlo said gently. You've been fighting very hard not to believe in God, because if God exists, then what happened in 1995 wasn't just a career mistake, it was a moral failure. And moral failures require forgiveness, not just better performance. You can't work your way out of guilt, Vicente. You can only accept that you're already forgiven and allow yourself to be transformed by that forgiveness. I couldn't speak. My entire body was shaking. Carlo reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His hand was warm, and there was a steadiness in his touch that seemed impossible for a 15-year-old. The work you've been doing, exposing fraud, protecting vulnerable people, it's good work, he said. But it's not penance, it's vocation. God has been using your guilt to drive you toward something beautiful, something redemptive. But Vicente, you've been so focused on earning forgiveness that you've missed the fact that you already have it. You've always had it. From the moment you felt guilt over what you did, God was already in the process of transforming it into something good. I sat there for several minutes, unable to move, unable to speak, tears streaming down my face in the middle of this ordinary cafe while afternoon traffic rumbled past outside and an espresso machine hissed somewhere behind the counter. Finally, I found my voice. How do you know these things about me? About 1995? About Elena? About the therapist? There's no way you could know any of that. Carlo smiled, and there was something in his expression that was both infinitely young and impossibly ancient. Let's just say I've been given certain insights, graces, the church would call them, ways of seeing that go beyond normal perception. That's not an answer, I said, though without real force. I was too exhausted, too emotionally raw to argue. I know, Carlo acknowledged, but it's the only answer I can give you right now. Vicente, I need to tell you something important, something I need you to promise you'll do. What? Someday, I can't tell you exactly when, but you'll know when the moment is right. I need you to tell this story. Our conversation today, what I knew about you, what we discussed, how it made you feel. I need you to share it publicly, even though people will be skeptical, even though some will think you're making it up or that you've lost touch with reality. I stared at him. Why would I do that? Because, Carlos said seriously, there are people like you, intelligent, skeptical, carrying secret guilts, who need to hear that transformation is possible, that forgiveness is real, that the universe isn't just cold, indifferent matter following blind physical laws. Your testimony will reach people who would never listen to a priest or read a theological book, but who might listen to a journalist, a skeptic, someone like themselves. But I don't have proof of any of this, I protested, any evidence. This entire conversation could be dismissed as— Exactly, Carlo interrupted, smiling. You'll have to testify without proof. You'll have to take a risk with your reputation, with your credibility, with your carefully constructed identity as a rational skeptic. You'll have to choose vulnerability over safety, truth over self-protection. The parallel wasn't lost on me. In 1995, I had chosen safety over truth. Now he was asking me to choose truth over safety. I can't make that promise, I said. I don't even know if what you're saying is true, if this conversation is real, or if I'm having some kind of psychological break. Yes, you can, Carlo said gently, and you will. Not today, maybe not for years, but eventually you'll reach a point where the cost of silence becomes greater than the cost of speaking. And when that moment comes, you'll remember this conversation, and you'll know what you need to do. He glanced at his watch, a simple digital watch, the kind any teenager might wear. I need to go soon. I have to meet my mother. But Vicente, I want you to know something. He leaned forward, his expression absolutely sincere. Your failure in 1995 doesn't define you. What defines you is what you've done with it, how you've let it drive you toward protecting others, toward seeking truth, toward developing a moral compass so sensitive that you can't even forgive yourself for something God forgave years ago. How can God forgive something if I don't believe in Him? God's forgiveness doesn't depend on your belief, any more than the sun depends on your acknowledgement to keep shining, Carlo said. It just is. The question is whether you're willing to accept it, to let it transform you from the inside out. He stood up, closed his laptop, and slid it into a backpack covered with video game patches, Pokémon, Super Mario, completely normal teenager stuff that seemed absurdly incongruous with the conversation we'd just had. One more thing, Carlo said, pausing before he left. You're going to hear that I died soon, very soon. When you hear that, don't let it shake your faith in this conversation. My death isn't a tragedy. It's a mission being completed. I came here to plant seeds, Vicente, and you're one of them. What does that mean? I asked, but he was already walking toward the door. At the exit, he turned back one last time. Be brave, Vicente. When the moment comes, be brave. And then he was gone, disappearing into the afternoon crowds on Via Pisani. Just another teenager with a backpack, completely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't just had their entire worldview shattered in a cafe conversation. I sat there for another hour, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Eventually, I paid for my long, cold espresso and stumbled out into the September afternoon, my notebook still empty of the Fratello Salvatore notes I had planned to organize. 4 days later, on October 12th, 2006, I opened the newspaper and saw a brief obituary. Carlo Acutis, age 15, had died of fulminant leukemia. The news of Carlo's death hit me with a force I couldn't have anticipated. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the obituary, reading and rereading those sparse lines of text that summarized 15 years of life in 3 short paragraphs. He had died so quickly. Leukemia diagnosed, 4 days of rapid decline, and gone. The obituary mentioned his passion for computers, his website documenting Eucharistic miracles, his devotion to daily Mass. It included information about a funeral service at Santa Maria Segreta Church in Milan. Elena found me at the table, the newspaper still open in front of me, tears streaming down my face. "Vicente, what's wrong?" "A boy died," I managed to say. "A 15-year-old boy." She assumed it was related to one of my investigations, another victim of the religious frauds I spent my life documenting. She hugged me, made tea, said the things spouses say when they don't fully understand why their partner is devastated but want to offer comfort anyway. I didn't explain. I couldn't. How do you explain that a stranger you met once in a cafe had looked into your soul, had seen secrets you'd never spoken aloud, had offered you a forgiveness you didn't think you deserved, and had then died 4 days later? For weeks after Carlo's death, I existed in a kind of fog. I kept working. I had deadlines, responsibilities, but my heart wasn't in it. The Fratello Salvatore story, which should have felt like a victory for justice, felt hollow. Yes, I had exposed another fraud. Yes, I had helped protect future victims. But so what? A 15-year-old boy who had actually understood something profound about the universe had died. and I was still here, still carrying my guilt, still unable to accept the forgiveness he had offered me. I found myself researching Carlo obsessively in whatever spare time I had. I discovered he had been something of a local phenomenon in Milan's Catholic community, a teenager who went to daily Mass, who had created a sophisticated website documenting Eucharistic miracles, who had an infectious joy and a deep spirituality that seemed impossible for someone his age. I read interviews his mother had given. She spoke about how Carlo had offered his suffering from leukemia as a prayer for the Pope and for the Church, how he had remained cheerful and faithful even as his body failed, how he had talked about death not as something to fear, but as a transition into the full presence of God. And I thought about what he had told me. My death isn't a tragedy. It's a mission being completed. What kind of 15-year-old talks about their own death as a completed mission? The years that followed Carlo's death were a slow, difficult process of transformation. I didn't have a dramatic conversion moment. I didn't suddenly start going to Mass or praying the Rosary. But I found that my absolute certainty about the universe being nothing but matter following physical laws had developed cracks. The work I did exposing religious fraud continued, but my relationship to it changed. I was no longer working from a place of cynical penance, but from something closer to authentic care. When I interviewed victims of spiritual manipulation, I found myself able to sit with their pain without needing to explain it away or reduce it to psychology and neuroscience. In 2011, 5 years after Carlo's death, I wrote a long investigative series about Fratello Salvatore and several other fraudulent healers operating in northern Italy. The series won several journalism awards and led to criminal convictions. At the awards ceremony, accepting a plaque and a check, I thought about that September afternoon in 2006, about Carlo asking me if my obsession with exposing religious fraud might actually be penance rather than pure altruism, about how he had been right, how I had been using my work to try to earn forgiveness rather than accepting I might already have it. I started, very tentatively, exploring faith, not in a committed way, not with any certainty, but with genuine curiosity. I visited churches not as a journalist investigating fraud, but as someone who was honestly confused about whether the universe might contain more mystery than I had previously allowed. In 2013, Elena and I had our first child, a daughter we named Sophia. Holding her in the hospital, feeling the weight of this tiny life depending entirely on me, I found myself thinking about responsibility and failure and forgiveness in new ways. What kind of father would I be? Would I teach Sophia that the universe was cold and indifferent, that morality was just a social construct, that faith was for people who couldn't handle reality? Or would I tell her the truth, that I had met someone who had seen into my soul, who had offered me forgiveness I didn't deserve, and who had challenged everything I thought I knew about the universe? On October 10th, 2020, Carlo Acutis was beatified in Assisi. I watched the ceremony online, tears streaming down my face as Pope Francis elevated this teenager to the status of blessed, one step away from sainthood. The news coverage was extensive. Stories about Carlo appeared in major international media: The New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde. He was being called the patron saint of the Internet, the first millennial blessed by the Catholic Church, an example of how holiness could exist in someone who loved video games and computer programming. I read interview after interview with people whose lives Carlo had touched, priests who had known him, friends from school, people who had visited his website and been moved by his documentation of Eucharistic miracles. But none of them mentioned what he had done for me, what he had seen in me, the impossible knowledge he had possessed. And I realized that I was carrying a piece of Carlo's story that the world didn't know, a testimony that needed to be shared. But I was still afraid of losing credibility, afraid of people thinking I had gone crazy or become one of those gullible believers I had spent my career exposing. Afraid of the same thing I had been afraid of in 1995, that telling the truth would cost me my reputation, my career, everything I had built. It's now 2024. I'm 52 years old. Sophia is 11, bright, curious, asking difficult questions about life and death and meaning. Elena and I have been married for 24 years. My career as an investigative journalist continues, though I've shifted focus somewhat, spending more time mentoring young journalists than pursuing major investigations myself. And I'm finally ready to fulfill the promise I made to Carlo, or rather, the promise he knew I would eventually make, even when I couldn't imagine keeping it. Because I've realized something over these 18 years since that September afternoon in Café Verdi. The fear that has governed so much of my life, the fear of exposure, of judgment, of losing control over how people perceive me, is the same fear that led me to bury that corruption story in 1995. And as long as I let that fear control me, as long as I choose safety over truth, I'm still that 23-year-old coward putting documents in a drawer instead of publishing them. Carlo asked me to be brave, to tell this story even though I have no proof, even though it will make some people question my judgment, even though it requires admitting that I encountered something I can't explain with rationalism and skepticism. So here it is, my testimony. On September 8th, 2006, I met a 15-year-old boy in a cafe who knew secrets about me that no one could have known. He saw the guilt I had carried for 11 years, the penance work I had been doing without realizing it was penance, the forgiveness I needed but couldn't accept. I can't prove this happened the way I'm describing. I have no recording of the conversation, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Any skeptical journalist, any version of my younger self could dismiss this entire story as confabulation, as false memory, as the delusions of a man who wants to believe his life has more meaning than mere biological accident. And maybe you will dismiss it. Maybe you're reading this or listening to this and thinking exactly what I would have thought 18 years ago, that I've gone soft, that I've lost my skeptical edge, that I've become exactly the kind of credulous believer I used to pity. That's okay. I'm not telling this story to convince you of anything. I'm telling it because there might be someone out there who is carrying secret guilt the way I carried mine. Someone who has built elaborate structures of rationalism and cynicism to avoid facing moral failures they can't forgive themselves for. Someone who is working frantically to earn redemption instead of accepting that they might already have it. If that's you, I want you to know the forgiveness you're seeking isn't at the end of enough good work. It's already here, already available, already offered. Your failure doesn't define you. What defines you is what you choose to do with it. Carlo Acutis died at 15, but his life accomplished more than most people achieve in 80 years. He planted seeds in websites, in conversations, in brief encounters with people like me that continue to bloom years after his death. I was one of those seeds, and this testimony is my way of honoring that, of finally being brave enough to speak a truth that has no proof, to testify to something I experienced but can't verify, to choose vulnerability over safety. My daughter Sophia asked me recently if I believe in miracles. It's a complicated question for someone who has spent his career investigating religious fraud. But I told her the truth. Yes, I believe in miracles, not because I've become irrational or because I've abandoned skepticism, but because I've experienced something that all my rationalism can't explain away. And I've learned that maybe, just maybe, the universe is stranger and more merciful than I once thought possible. Carlo told me that God's forgiveness doesn't depend on our belief in it, any more than the sun depends on our acknowledgement to keep shining. I've spent 18 years testing that claim, pushing against it, trying to find the limits of it, and I've found that it's true. The guilt I carried for 29 years, from 1995 to that afternoon in 2006, began to transform the moment Carlo named it, the moment he offered me forgiveness I didn't think I deserved. It didn't disappear immediately. Transformation isn't instant. But it began, and it has continued. And I am not the same person I was in that cafe 18 years ago. If you're listening to this, and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're carrying secret shame, if you've built your life around trying to earn redemption through good works, if you're afraid of being vulnerable, I want to tell you what Carlo told me. You've been forgiven for a long time. You just haven't forgiven yourself. The question isn't whether forgiveness is available. It is. It always has been. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it. Blessed Carlo Acutis, who saw into my soul when I needed it most, who offered me a gift I didn't know how to receive, who died at 15, having completed a mission I'm still trying to understand. Pray for us. Pray for everyone carrying secret guilts. Pray for everyone who has built walls of skepticism to protect wounded hearts. Pray for everyone who needs the courage to choose truth over safety, vulnerability over control, faith over fear. And pray especially for people like I was, people so committed to rationalism that they've forgotten that the deepest truths are often the ones that can't be proven, only experienced and testified to. This is my testimony. Imperfect, unprovable, possibly unbelievable. But it's true. And sometimes the truest things are the ones we can't verify. We can only live them, and then, when the moment is right, when we're finally brave enough, share them with whoever needs to hear. Amen.